This time you could sense the confidence that ISRO had.
People are applauding.
So the confidence was very apparent, and it was palpable. You could sense it in every ISRO person you met there, and that didn't come simply because they had spent 4 years trying to build a project. It came from a lot of testing data that they had. They had a plan B virtually for everything. From launch date till the day Vikram landed on August 23rd, they had plan B for everything. And the good thing is for ISRO that they didn't have to use any of the redundancies. They didn't have to fall back on any salvage modes. Their plan A worked flawlessly. Vikram, the project director, was telling me, he said there have been rovers on moon which have spent 6 months and covered about 100 to 120 meters. We've covered 100 meters in about 10 days. ISRO needed to know when the spacecraft would leave, at what time, at what second that it would leave in that path towards the moon. Because if it left a second later or earlier, that would mean that the position of the moon there would have changed. So which means you would have to do another maneuver, let's say, to capture the lunar orbit. 2019, as soon as Chandrayaan-2 failed, ISRO decided to go ahead with Chandrayaan-3.
3, 2, 1, 0.
Nearly 500 people at least, have worked for 4 years relentlessly, and the core team has done, I think, a fantastic job. Why it's important for the global community, why everybody else is, because moon is back in focus.
Chetan, when you talk of Chandrayaan-3, for you, what was the most exciting part of covering this story?
I think the most exciting part of covering this comes, you'll have to go back 4 years ago when we were sitting in just outside the MOX, or Missions Operations Complex of ISRO, and witnessed Vikram crashing down on the lunar surface on the intervening night of September 6 and 7, 2019. So from there to almost immediately conceive a follow-on mission and putting teams together, and ISRO began its work for Chandrayaan-3 at a great speed. But then in the last 4 years, there's been a lot of work that has gone on, and each phase being very exciting for the teams. And in terms of reportage, I think, if you were to ask about one instance, it would again be the landing, because landing happened and everybody was watching. But covering the landing this time was not nearly as exciting as covering the Chandrayaan-2 landing was, because there was a lot more drama in 2019. This time you could sense the confidence that ISRO had. Just to give you an instance, if my memory serves me right, in 2019, the place that we were all put, there was a dais there for post-landing announcements and things like that. That remained empty at the time we landed there, in the night. But this time, as soon as I saw there, what I saw was there were chairs arranged, 6 chairs. So ISRO really knew that they would be coming there and having a discussion. So the confidence was very apparent, and it was palpable. You could sense it in every ISRO person you met there. And that didn't come simply because they had spent 4 years trying to build a project. It came from a lot of testing data that they had. They've done thousands of simulations, more than 1 lakh, and the key tests, 3 major tests that they've developed, test beds that were developed, they've seen more than 80 tests. So there's been a lot of work from the design part to analyzing the various failure scenarios that could come up during the whole power descent phase, and to try and address each one of those. They had a plan B virtually for everything. From launch date till the day Vikram landed on August 23rd, they had plan B for everything. And the good thing is for ISRO that they didn't have to use any of the redundancies. They didn't have to fall back on any salvage modes. Their planning worked flawlessly. Chandrayaan-2 orbiter in the last 4 years had sent a whopping 65 terabytes of data. So roughly, 1 terabyte holds about 500 hours of movies. So you can just imagine how much data has come down.
Take us through, how some of the data, even though many would think that Chandrayaan-2, because the landing didn't happen, the Vikram lander didn't land properly, was that mission a complete failure? No. And if you could explain for our viewers that, any data that comes in gets used. In fact, other missions benefit from that. Of course, ISRO has benefited from those calculations.
Chandrayaan-2, the ISRO had already in 2008 managed to put an orbiter around moon with Chandrayaan-1. It also carried a MIP or moon impact probe, which was designed to be thrown onto the lunar surface and let it crash. So getting to moon and going around moon was not really a challenge for India, or at least it shouldn't have been. So with Chandrayaan-2, that being achieved, the mission's primary focus was still to achieve a soft landing and, deploy a rover to do on-ground or in-situ experiments. That remained elusive, and therefore the mission was really not a complete success. But the orbiter is still going around, and it carries about 8 payloads. It studies a variety of things about moon through remote sensing. From a distance of, I think, roughly 125 kilometers, it's still in a low lunar orbit of that range. And it's not only studying the moon, but the orbiter of Chandrayaan-2 is also studying a little bit of the sun. And a number of ISRO has now, after, initially for the first 6 to 8 months, the data was protected. The principal investigators had the first right to go through it. But from there on, it's been made public. So the data has been used by scientists across the world, and Indian astrophysicists have also used some of this data. So and see, for Chandrayaan-3 directly, the advantage that of having an orbiter there was one. It for the first time had ISRO for the first time had really high resolution images of where it wanted to go on the moon. For Chandrayaan-2, it relied on other orbiters of other countries, some of which were legacy instruments. The LRO of NASA, for instance, was sent to moon in 2009. Compared to that, the orbiter high-resolution camera on Chandrayaan-2 orbiter it gives you a lot more clarity of the lunar surface. So for Chandrayaan-3, they had the luxury of using those images, and also Chandrayaan-2 orbiter still acts as a relay point for data transfer from Vikram in case Vikram can't talk directly to the ground station when it was still awake and working. So it also served that purpose. So Chandrayaan-2, yes, just about talking about the data, ground stations have when I was last checking, in July or mid-August, when I was checking, Chandrayaan-2 orbiter in the last 4 years had sent a whopping 65 terabytes of data. So roughly, 1 terabyte holds about 500 hours of movies. So you can just imagine how much data has come down.
If we were to sort of plot that on a timeline, it would be very helpful for users, viewers, to understand how the entire thing, at least in the focus part, there's a lot of backend that happens, of course, before the mission. But if you could take us through that entire timeline.
See, in 2019, as soon as Chandrayaan-2 failed, ISRO decided to go ahead with Chandrayaan-3. And as early as November 2019, I think the review committee sat down and finalized on designs. All this was happening while parallelly the failure analysis committee of Chandrayaan-2 was trying to understand what had caused the failure on Chandrayaan-2. So once that information was available, the design and configurations for Chandrayaan-3 were finalized. And this happened very, very early. By mid 2020, they were already getting on to, designing various, aspects of the Vikram lander. They had already decided that the legs needed to be strengthened, and some of the other issues that Chandrayaan-2 had shown them had to be addressed. So from there on, the work on Chandrayaan-3 started at subsystem level. At multiple reviews were going on, and procurement had begun. And 2020, COVID hit, but that didn't stop Chandrayaan-2's development. It may have delayed it a bit, primarily because of procurement issues, and also uh, getting to places. The initial 40 to 80 days where everything was closed was particularly challenging, but it moved on. And from there, I think if you jump to, the various tests were conducted in this process, and then you jump to the launch date in July. Post-launch was the phase where Chandrayaan-3 went around Earth. It carried out, 5 major earthbound maneuvers, where with each of that, your altitude or the apogee, the distance, the farthest point from Earth, kept increasing. And finally, the maneuver to push it in the path towards Moon, the translunar insertion or injection, was carried out. And from there on, it took another 5.5, 6 days for it to reach the lunar orbit uh, and enter the Moon's sphere of influence, where the lunar orbit insertion happened. And from there on, there were another five, lunar-bound maneuvers, where while on the Earth-bound maneuvers, the idea was to keep increasing the distance from Earth, and the apogee kept going. The elliptical orbit sort of kept increasing, and at TLI, when it was completed, by the time TLI started, the apogee was about 1 lakh, and then at the end of it, it had become 360 kilometers. But lunar-bound maneuvers, it was the exact opposite. The idea was to bring it closer to the lunar surface, the periloon as we speak, and the apoloon. So they had to bring down the apoloon. The farthest point from Moon had to be reduced with each of those maneuvers before August 17th, a key juncture where the lander module separated from the propulsion module, and for the first time became independent since the launch. And from there on, the lander module, which is basically Vikram with Pragyan, the rover inside its belly, performed 2 deboost maneuvers to get into a circular orbit. And the second deboost put it in the pre-landing orbit of 25 kilometers into 100. And that was also, before the deboost happened, they got into a circular orbit of 100 by 100 roughly, but it was a little more than 100, and then the separation happened. So this deboost, the pre-landing orbit was about 25 into 130 odd, and eventually that got corrected, and by the time August 23rd power descent started, it had auto-corrected itself to start from about 30 kilometers. And from there, everybody's seen what has happened. The landing was, picture perfect, no redundancies needed to be used. And after that, after several hours post midnight on August 23rd, and early on August 24th, the deployment of the rover happened. And then the rover's gone around the lunar surface for the next 10 days. It's covered about a little more than 100 meters, which is in itself, as the Viramuthu Whale, the project director, was telling me. He said there have been rovers on Moon which have spent 6 months and covered about 100 to 120 meters. We've covered 100 meters in about 10 days. That means it's done a lot of walking around. And Pragyan's designed to move only at 1 centimeter per second. So it has its limitations, and its 2 eyes, the onboard navigation cameras, are they barely weigh about 120 grams. So, and they were designed to survive the night. Hopefully, Pragyan's movement was not completely autonomous. So each time it had to move, it had to take those images, which it could do for up to 5 odd meters, and that would be communicated to Vikram, the lander. Then the lander would send it back to Earth, and then the teams in ISRO would sit down and develop what is called a digital elevation model, DEM, for about 5 meters. They use all these images to see if it's a safe path, and then they send that back and uplink a command saying, okay, you're safe to move. And then Pragyan would move for 5 meters. So to do this 5 meters of movement, the turnaround time was about 5 hours. So which is why, although it stayed there for 10 days, which is roughly 14,400 odd minutes, Pragya has actually moved only for about 167 minutes on Moon. That is if 100 meters.
It's fascinating to listen to you even explain it, because when people see posts that ISRO put out, and there's a lot of excitement about, wow, 10 days, 100 meters, great, but this whole calculations, everything that's happening behind the scenes to make that happen is in itself quite fascinating. And that brings me to my next question on the hop and why that is also a big thing.
The headline was to, at least the one that I had conceived, was that a short hop for Vikram spurs hopes of giant leap in the future, borrowing from Armstrong. But to see what it means primarily is that ISRO now also has some learning, data from uh, how to reignite or kickstart an engine once it has landed on moon. While Chandrayaan-3 was designed to just go there and do its job and then remain on moon forever. In the future, missions would be aiming at bringing back samples to Earth, and eventually maybe 2 decades, if that is the kind of timeline, if Gaganyaan happens in the next 2 to 3 years, and then you put forth a timeline for humans, more sustained human space program that India might want to do, and eventually land on moon. Then for all of those things, when you're designing those landers or those spacecraft, which not only have to go there but also at some point restart and come back, uh, this data would be really, really useful. Because see, if you look at the jump, it's only for about 40 centimeters, which is roughly about, I think, this much. And for the size that Vikram is, it would have just done this. But the whole thing was about restarting those engines, because on Earth, no matter how many simulations you do, you try to, ISRO has about 60 tons of lunar soil simulant, which is almost a 99.6% match with what samples were brought back with the Apollo program of the US. So the soil simulant that has been developed here is nearly a perfect match of the lunar soil. But that's only the soil. The whole environment, there are great limitations to mimic, an environment of another place, especially the moon. So no number of simulations here could have given you the kind of understanding of whether or not the engines can refire, whether they can cause a lift, and then can you land back safely in case you lift and then it's not good enough. Can you land back again and then try that all over again? When you're doing sample return and human missions, that would be of great use for ISRO. Although what they would have got from this, the engine was basically fired for less than 20-30 seconds, the final hop one. But before that, there were multiple things that ISRO did. They first, because Vikram was already on the lunar surface, it was doing other things. They first had to test if the engine was healthy, so the engine tests were carried out. Then ISRO did a small firing without, a lift. Then they did a firing where Vikram went up a bit and came back in the same place. Then finally attempted the hop. So even before the hop, there was last Saturday, the evening was quite hectic for the project team, uh, because they started maybe a little after this time, maybe around 4 or 5, I think, yeah. And then went on, and finally the hop was achieved between 2 and 3 a.m. on Sunday. So it was quite hectic, but that is the importance of hop. But for Chandrayaan-3 itself, what it does is it gives 2 of those or 3 of those payloads on the lander to also do experiments in a slightly different location. While they've already measured the temperature in one in the landing spot, the initial one, and then now they get to do it about 40 centimeters away, so a newer area on moon for you to study that.